So I'm sure that everybody has heard by now of US Congress passing the Lend-Lease Act for Ukraine. Now, this Lend-Lease Act is basically just cutting some bureaucratic red tape, and it's going to make it easier on a bureaucratic level for the United States to supply more arms to Ukraine in the future. So what I would like to talk about right now is not the Lend-Lease Act itself, but the general trend of the United States and of Western countries and West-aligned countries supplying Ukraine with increasing amounts of weaponry. When the war first started, the United States announced that it would donate about $800 million worth of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Then there was another package of military aid to Ukraine, which was worth over $1 billion. And now we are seeing this proposed package that is worth over $20 billion, plus another $10 billion on top of that to support the Ukrainian economy. All of this coming from a country that is entering into a deep economic crisis. And by the way, all of this applies to a lot of European countries as well. For example, we're seeing Germany entering into a deep recession which has no end in sight, and yet they are pledging to increase their military budget by over $100 billion in just 1 year. Absolutely clown world stuff. And what I want to talk about today is this growing mission creep from Western countries when it comes to militarily supporting Ukraine. We are already seeing an exponential growth in the military and political commitments that the West is making to Ukraine. Over the course of just 1 month, they've went from sending $800 million to the Ukrainian military to sending $23 billion. And this, by the way, is yet another sign that Ukraine is clearly beating back the Russians and is clearly winning the war. The fact that the West is feeling the need to increase its support to Ukraine by so much so quickly. But on a more serious note, if we are going to see this exponential increase in the amount of military and economic funding of Ukraine continue, then there is the very real risk that the West will simply bankrupt itself in supporting Ukraine. Or if not completely bankrupt itself, then at the very least leave itself so hollowed out in economic and in military terms that it won't be able to fight the real Cold War, which is against China. And this is what I want to talk about today. A lot of people make the big mistake in thinking that the US military-industrial complex has unlimited manufacturing capabilities, that it can continue to produce all types of equipment in unlimited quantities, that the US government can simply print more money and throw it at its military-industrial complex, and that this will somehow increase the amount of weapon systems that the military-industrial complex is physically capable of producing, and that this can continue basically up to infinity. That the US military-industrial complex and the US manufacturing base as a whole has unlimited resources. And obviously, none of this is true. This idea that anyone has unlimited resources is ridiculous. But on top of that, the US military-industrial complex isn't even the biggest military-industrial complex in the world. If one compares the military industries of the three great powers, that is, Russia, the United States, and China, one can notice some very interesting peculiarities. The first is that the Chinese military-industrial complex is actually the largest in the world. If one compares the number of naval vessels, fixed-wing aircraft, drones, missiles, radars, tanks that the Chinese armed forces procure every year, one will notice that it is, in fact, considerably more than what the United States military procures every single year. And by the way, this is most noticeable when comparing the navies and the air forces of the two countries. To be clear, I'm not talking about the number of equipment that both countries currently have. The United States has, at least for now, more overall equipment, but that is because a lot of US equipment that is in service today was produced in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. I am talking about the amount of new equipment that is being procured every single year. In this criteria, China is exceeding the United States. China is procuring more new military equipment than the United States is. And this remains true even if one considers US military exports. And I am not even mentioning the fact that the Chinese military industry is rapidly expanding, whereas the US military industry has more or less peaked. And the same interesting trend applies to Russia as well. Mainstream Western propaganda constantly regards Russia as this poor country with an economy the size of Italy, Greece, the Galapagos Islands, you name it. So they push this ridiculous view that Russia isn't some sort of huge manufacturing power, that it's this worthless poor country. And to back up this claim, they always cite the one figure which in fact means absolutely nothing, and that is nominal GDP. Now, this is a rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into too much further. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on this matter, then you can check out one of my old videos which talks about China and compares the economies of China and the United States. I'm going to link it in the video description. And all of the things in that video which I described for China, pretty much all of them apply to Russia as well. So you can watch that video if you want, but moving this topic to one side, I want to get back to the military-industrial complex. Because at the end of the day, it isn't the overall economy that controls how much weapon systems one country or another can produce. It is the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is just one very specific subsector of the overall economy, and it is the one subsector which takes decades and decades to build up. And at the end of the day, that is all that matters. Now, as to the Russian military-industrial complex, if one looks at the number of naval vessels, aircraft, armored vehicles that the Russian military produces and procures every single year, and if one also takes into account heavy weapon systems like intercontinental ballistic missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, nuclear-powered cruise missiles, ICBM interceptors, and lots of other equipment that the United States either has no equivalent of or doesn't have any production lines of for one reason or another, then one will notice that the Russian military-industrial complex is also by itself comparable in size and scale to that of the United States. So why am I mentioning all of this? Well, at the end of the day, a lot of wars are ultimately won on the production lines. And the military-industrial complex always plays a huge role in deciding the outcome of any war. For example, the United States Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, all of these wars were ultimately decided on the production lines. In the case of the American Civil War, the Union simply had a lot more industrial capacity than the Confederacy, and that's why they won the war. It is one of the big reasons for why they won the war. And the same is true for the Entente in World War I and for the Allied powers in World War II. In all of these wars, one side won because they were able to produce a lot more ammunition and a lot more fighting equipment than their opponents. And as a direct result, with every week and month that passed, the numerical superiority of one side over the other kept on growing. Specifically when it comes to the numbers of fighting equipment involved. That is to say, the number of artillery shells that can be fired, the number of artillery guns, the number of tanks, aircraft, and so on. And this is true for Ukraine as well. Now, I've said before that when it comes to the war in Ukraine, It's a mistake to think that Russia and Ukraine are the only two sides involved, because more or less the entire world is involved in one way or another. And the primary actors aren't Russia and Ukraine, they are the power blocks that Russia and Ukraine respectively belong to. Just like Ukraine is simply a pawn in this war, it's something that the collective West wants to use to weaken Russia. Russia is also not the main piece in this war. Russia is, if not the pawn, then probably something like the knight or the rook. And I've said this before, this is exactly why the Western strategy to weaken Russia via Ukraine is so blatantly stupid. They aren't trying to weaken the king, they are trying to weaken the knight. And in doing so, they are funneling increasing amounts of military equipment and economic support to their pawn, which is Ukraine. But at the end of the day, this is still a contest between two power blocks. And this contest will be decided by many things, one of which is the military-industrial complex. Whichever side can produce more equipment and can throw more numbers of equipment onto the battlefield will have the advantage. And if you are fighting against a power that has a superior manufacturing base, then the only way that you can win is by outfighting them, by ensuring that your opponent consistently loses more military equipment than what you are losing. And that is very difficult to do in the best scenario. Sometimes people bring up the wars in Afghanistan, that is to say, first the Soviet war, then the American war, as an example of this, as an example of how a country with an inferior fighting force and less amount of equipment can defeat a military superpower. But to put it frankly, comparing the wars in Afghanistan to the war that is going on in Ukraine is, well, foolish. It is very foolish. The wars in Afghanistan were defined by guerrilla movements. They were guerrilla wars. Such guerrilla wars are made possible by the fact that in Afghanistan you have a population with a very high fertility rate, with low employment, so as a result you have a lot of young men running around that have nothing to do except to fight against this foreign invader. And by foreign invader, I mean an invader that doesn't just come from what is legally considered to be a different country, but comes from an entirely different culture, speaks a different language, tries to impose a completely foreign set of values onto the country, which the people of the country by and large do not want. And on top of this cultural and linguistic barrier, you also have very rough mountainous terrain in Afghanistan, which makes it very difficult for armored vehicles and even for any sort of organized troop movements to traverse the terrain. There are a lot of ambush and vantage points, all of which is completely diametrically opposite to what you have in Ukraine, where you basically have almost completely flat and unforested terrain with a few forests in the west. And on top of this, there is one more factor which makes a guerrilla war, if not completely impossible, then at the very least much more difficult and much less effective. And that is recent advancements in technology. And not as much military technology as much as big data, artificial intelligence, facial recognition, voice recognition, and all of the other technologies that are commonly associated with Big Brother. All of these technologies weren't around at the height of the US invasion of Afghanistan, but they are around today. And in a country where most of the population resides in urban areas, such as Ukraine, these technologies would make a guerrilla war pretty much impossible. It would be next to impossible even if all of the other factors weren't present. By itself, this one factor makes guerrilla warfare much more difficult, but with all of the other factors present as well, any hopes that the Western powers might have of there being a guerrilla war in Ukraine can be safely buried. Ukraine is nothing like Afghanistan, And it is stupid to think that millions of everyday Ukrainians are going to sacrifice the lives of their husbands and their sons by the millions in order to suit the ambitions of the political elite in Washington. There isn't going to be a guerrilla war in Ukraine. So with the prospect of a guerrilla war out of the question, the only option that remains is a direct, conventional military versus military clash. And this is the type of war which is often won on the production lines. This is where all of the numbers of equipment that both sides can throw at each other really matters. Now, I've said before that if you can't out-manufacture your enemy, the only way to beat them is to outfight them, to ensure that your enemy loses more equipment than the equipment that you lose, so that your enemy loses 5 tanks, 5 airplanes for every 1 tank and airplane that you lose. And putting this insane Western propaganda, which is constantly parroting these ridiculous tales of Ukrainian victories, Ghost of Kiev, and all that to one side, is this what is happening in Ukraine? No, it's not. The exact opposite is happening in Ukraine. Russia is outfighting Ukraine. Much more Ukrainian equipment is being lost on the battlefield than Russian equipment. And if the collective West continues with this mission creep of sending more and more equipment to Ukraine, this trend is only going to grow further. Instead of seeing a 5-to-1 or a 10-to-1 ratio of Ukrainian to Russian equipment destroyed, you're going to start seeing 20, 50-to-1, a lot more than what you're seeing today. And this is going to be the consequence of the simple fact that all of this equipment that is being sent to Ukraine is not going to be used by a professional fighting force. Ukraine is seeing increasing shortages of capable, experienced fighters. And if that weren't bad enough, there's basically nobody in Ukraine who can operate Western equipment. All of Ukraine's soldiers are trained to operate Warsaw Pact equipment. They are trained to operate Soviet equipment. If you put a tank driver who is used to driving a T-64 tank into a Leopard 2 or an M1 Abrams tank, they aren't going to know how to drive it. Now, of course, you can retrain them, you can ship them to a Western country, give them a 10-week, 20-week training course there and ship them back to Ukraine. And even though this is very, very difficult from a logistical perspective, this is exactly what the West is doing right now. And there is talk of training all of these soldiers to operate Western tanks, artillery systems, radars, anti-aircraft systems, and even manned fixed-wing aircraft. But even if you do this, you will still run into the problem that someone who has 10 weeks of military experience, 10 weeks of experience operating whatever platform that they're operating, isn't going to be comparable to somebody who is a combat veteran with several years of experience. And on top of this, there is also the problem that the equipment that is being sent to Ukraine is being sent in small packages. It's not like an entire military is entering Ukraine all at once. It's not like you have air defense systems which are defending tanks, which are defending anti-missile systems, which are defending airfields from which aircraft are taking off, and then you have electronic warfare systems, all of which are operating in tandem. That is what we are seeing in the Russian military. We are seeing a combined arms operation, but that isn't what we are seeing in the Ukrainian military, especially when the West decides to send this small batch of tanks, followed by this small batch of artillery systems, and so on. So because you have this logistical mess, combined with the fact that you have no coherent combined force in Ukraine, the natural consequence of this is that Ukraine is going to start losing even more equipment than it has already. And this is going to drain the coffers and the stockpiles of Western militaries even further. It is going to empty them out before the real Cold War, which is going to be fought with the real superpower of the East, which is China, before that Cold War is going to emerge. And on top of this, Russia has also begun destroying Ukrainian railroads and bridges. This is going to complicate Western arms deliveries exponentially. Now, Russia going after Ukrainian logistics deserves a whole other video. It is a very interesting topic that should be discussed. Long story short is that Russia hasn't gone after Ukrainian logistics 100%. It has only destroyed a few key railroads and a few important bridges, and this has already partly paralyzed Ukrainian transport and logistical capabilities, but Russia can paralyze them much more and much further than it already has. Most notably, the 3 or 4 large bridges which Ukraine has that cross the Dnieper River. And for those who don't know, the Dnieper is basically this massive river that is several hundred meters wide that cuts directly across the center of Ukraine. Those bridges haven't been destroyed yet. If they are destroyed, then movement between eastern and western Ukraine is going to become next to impossible. And all indications are that there is some political reason for which the Russian military is refusing to destroy these bridges, even as it is destroying important railroad links and bridges in other parts of Ukraine. But if the military situation calls for it, then all it takes to destroy these bridges is a few missile strikes. So Russia still has lots of room to escalate and to complicate the situation for the collective West much further than it already has. But even the amount of damage that has already been inflicted is very significant. It is much more difficult for all of these vehicles to cross through the entirety of Ukraine, which is on the order of 1,000 kilometers by road if you're moving from the western borders of Ukraine to the contact line in Donbass, or possibly around 700 kilometers if you're moving towards the Nikolaev front. In a country that is facing a critical fuel shortage, moving these incredibly heavy Western armored vehicles, which I've mentioned before are much heavier than their Ukrainian and Russian counterparts, possibly even having to conduct extensive maintenance after having a 70-ton Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams tank move 500 or 1,000 kilometers on its own power. All of that is going to diminish the effectiveness of Western arms supplies even further. So this is the clear trend that we are seeing. The more equipment that the West delivers to Ukraine, the less effective that equipment is. These arms deliveries are starting to run into the problem of diminishing returns, primarily because of the fact that there simply aren't enough trained personnel to use all of this equipment, but also because this equipment isn't being used in combined arms operations, and because the logistical complexities of moving all of this equipment from Western and Central Europe to southern and eastern Ukraine are becoming greater and greater. So all of these arms shipments might inflict some casualties upon the Russian military, but they won't change anything on the strategic level. Ukraine is still going to be militarily outmatched, and it's still going to lose this war. And knowing the insane neocons and neoliberals in the European Union and in the United States who have no reverse gear, they are going to see all of this equipment get destroyed, they are going to see more of this equipment get captured, and they aren't going to back down and cut off this insane policy of sending increasing amounts of weapons to Ukraine. I am pretty much certain that they are going to continue with their mission creep, that they are going to continue sending more and more equipment to Ukraine, and that they are going to keep providing exponentially more military and financial assistance, even as their own economies are entering unprecedented recessions to which there is no end in sight. And all of that is simply going to hollow out the economic and military capabilities of the collective West before the real Cold War starts. And like I've said before, the only other thing that the West can do is to go through with a massive full-scale NATO military intervention into Ukraine and risk a nuclear war with Russia. That is the only thing that is going to allow the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian country as it is today to continue existing. In any other scenario, the fate of Ukraine has already been sealed, and any attempts to avert it are simply going to incur a cost for which there is going to be no benefit. And this is the problem that the collective West is running into. With that said, I hope that you have enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, especially if you're watching this video on YouTube. It helps the algorithm recommend this video to more people. And also, if you haven't already, please be sure to check out my channels on other platforms. If you're watching this video on YouTube, the links in the video description will be to my Rumble and my Telegram channel, whereas the links on Rumble will be to my YouTube and my Telegram channel respectively. Rumble and Telegram are both amazing free speech platforms with no political censorship, and that is why I am strongly recommending them. Plus, Telegram is a great platform that allows me to give you small updates, and if you visit other channels on Telegram, there are many channels which provide constant updates on the situation in the ground in Ukraine. And ever since this war began, Telegram has basically been universally regarded as the best platform to get live news updates right now for the war in Ukraine, but I think that Telegram is going to continue being such a platform that provides continuous updates for any wars and any big political events that happen anywhere in the world. Anyways, with all of that said, I thank you for watching this video, and I wish you all a wonderful day.